Welcome to Widemindedness with Victoria Ball, the podcast in which I interview expert guests who want to join me in celebrating that life is not black and white. Our society is increasingly divided, and the us versus them mentality seems to dominate our conversations and relationships with others. I believe that life is much richer when we widen our minds to consider multiple opinions and perspectives. So challenge your assumptions and let's become truly wide-minded together. Tom Chigbo is a Senior Organiser for Citizens UK, a community organising alliance of faith, education and civil society groups who take action together for the common good. His role involves building relationships across diverse communities, delivering leadership training and campaigning for social justice. He began his career at Citizens UK with Money Mentors, a community financial literacy campaign in response to the UK recession. He later directed CitySafe, an initiative that rebuilt relationships between young people, small businesses and the Metropolitan Police, and opened over 600 safe havens across the capital. In 2015, he launched Leeds Citizens, an alliance of 30 faith, education and community groups, campaigning to address issues of low pay, mental health and youth opportunities around the city. Their campaign successes include a new citywide primary care mental health service, improved dementia care services to better meet the needs of BME communities, £500,000 worth of housing estate repairs, road safety improvements, reduced bus fares for 16 to 18-year-olds, and pay rises for the lowest paid staff at Leeds City Council. Tom graduated from the University of Cambridge, where he made history by becoming the university's first black student union president, a full-time role representing 20,000 students. His achievements were recognised by Rare, who named him their first No.1 Rising Star in 2009. Tom serves on the board of directors for Amnesty International UK, an NGO working around the world to promote human rights. Hello, Tom. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hello.
You work with faith, education, community groups. How do you make sure that you are listening to those different points of views, those different opinions, before taking action?
Yeah. So at Citizens UK, we work in the context of what we call a broad-based community organising alliance. So we deliberately seek out diverse, mixed groups of organisations or institutions in a place. So rather than kind of being lobbyists for a particular single or narrow interest, we try and bring together, churches, mosques, synagogues, schools, trade unions, charities, universities, all different groups in an area to work together. So starting with a broad base means that you're instantly bringing together these different groups rather than working in silos. We spend time having deep conversations to build relationships and understand what challenges people are facing or what ambitions they have for their area. And by having that dedicated time, that means that we're not starting with any assumptions. That means that we're not just working off something that's been handed down from somewhere else. We're giving people the space to actually listen to each other and use that to determine what's important. And that listening can take place, individually or through group meetings. And then before we decide on a campaign being a priority for action, we actually hold events called delegates assemblies. And these are simple gatherings where basically people representing different communities and organizations meet in a room, and they have to spend time listening to personal testimonies from people who we've encountered in the listening campaign. So stories of hardship or injustice or challenges that people are facing. We sit there together and we listen to people's stories. And then after we've listened to those testimonies, we discuss and then we get to vote on what our priorities are. However, the voting normally takes place rather than each individual being able to vote on their own. You have to vote as part of a community. And so you might have, each organization gets a vote. And that vote is dependent on the organization being represented by multiple people. What it does is it forces you to have conversations with people about the stories that you're hearing. and it forces you to have a kind of collective form of discernment where I can't just sit there thinking, well, you know what, I really, really care about transport. And so whatever happens, I'm going into this meeting ready to exercise my vote for transport.
It's really easy to have a kind of pre-prepared opinion, and the problem with that is then you don't listen to the effect that other people's stories, for example, might have on you. You mentioned there that you do some of that work in big group settings and also in one-to-one conversations. I just wanted to ask what the value was of those two different forms of communication.
Yeah, in community organizing, the one-to-one conversation is almost like the cornerstone of all the action, and I think it's one of the things that makes our way of making change distinctive. Really, a deep conversation where you're sharing your story or your background and what motivates you, what your ambitions are, what makes you angry, your experiences of injustice. You know, a really deep conversation about who you are, basically, and why you who you are, why you do, what you care about, and you listen to somebody else's version of that as well, rather than a kind of superficial conversation that's kind of, I don't know, chatting, or rather than a conversation where you're kind of trying to promote something or you're trying to um, just make progress on a task. So we actually take this really seriously, and we train volunteers from different communities in how to do these conversations and how to get really good at the craft of having these conversations by listening to people's self-interest and revealing some of your own self-interest. That allows the two people to kind of identify the potential common interest and where you might work together. In other settings, we might do group meetings in people's houses, or in churches or schools, to look at issues, and you might not, you can't quite recreate the same atmosphere that you would get with a one-to-one, but we do sometimes use particular tools within meetings to make them more relational. Both are helpful, both allow people to build relationships with each other, both allow people to share their story, and both, I suppose, create spaces where people can be moved and influenced by what somebody else is saying, rather than just being spaces to broadcast what we already think.
The work that Tom is doing is so inspiring. If you'd like to hear more brilliant, wide-minded stories, please sign up to my monthly newsletter at victoria-ball.com and follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Widemindedness Victoria Ball. And please remember to rate and review this podcast so that others can find it too. An area that I'm always fascinated by, because it's an area where there are obviously very strong convictions, is that of interfaith dialogue. I was really keen to understand how an organisation like Citizens UK that is so practical and action-led, how do you tackle something in that arena?
In Leeds, we're working with a variety of churches of different denominations. We've worked with synagogues, mosques. We've got a Buddhist centre in membership, so different faiths. So I think the practical action actually is something which um, enhances interfaith dialogue, and I think is something which can make interfaith dialogue and relationships more meaningful and more tangible, particularly for people who aren't clergy or senior leaders within their faith context. I think there are lots and lots of good examples around the country of people from different faiths learning about each other's faiths or the theologies behind them, and reading scripture or other books to help us understand and get an insight into what people believe and why they believe it. And all of those things are good. I think what community organizing adds is a mechanism for the people in those different religious communities to spend time with each other on something practical, to change something that they both identify as being in their self-interest.
We are seeing a global trend that's being referred to as the growth of the nones, Nones. I just wondered if you could explain that.
It comes from a lot of research that started in the US over the last sort of 10, 20 years. Places like the Pew Research Center have been tracking the decline in religious affiliation. And alongside that decline, there's been a rise in the number of people who might describe their religious identity as atheist or agnostic, or would use the phrase, nothing in particular, or who aren't members of a faith group. Um, and that's been a persistent trend over the last sort of 10, 20 years. And similarly, even within some faith groups, so for example, within the Christian community in the US, there's been a decline in the number of people who attend church monthly or more regularly. So back in 2007, most Christians in the United States attended church monthly or more regularly than that. And since 2015, that switched. So now the majority of Christians in the US attend church very irregularly, so a few times a year or less often than that. And there seems to be a kind of there seems to be a generational gap in many places in Western Europe, Australia, the United States, and New Zealand, where there's declining numbers of millennials who are affiliated with religious groups. So in the United States, for example, about 40% of millennials right now are unaffiliated, and that compares with about 17% of baby boomers. So there's there.
Mm.
So the term nuns originally describes people who aren't religiously affiliated and the growth of that group, and that maps onto other trends where people are not just not affiliated in religion, but also are not members of other types of civic institution that, for example, trade unions or local neighborhood groups and things like that. So that seems to be a trend in a lot of places. And on the one hand, some people might be relaxed about that. They might feel like, well, as long as people are happy. Um, there are lots of reasons why people mistrust institutions, and there's been a lot of there have been a lot of scandals in many institutions, and there are a lot of good reasons why people may have lost faith in organizations to represent them well, to keep them safe, to stand up for the common good. So I get that, and I understand and appreciate that, and I say that as somebody who is a member of many organizations and a member of a church, and feels often feels frustrated with them in all sorts of ways. However, I think there is a problem here that affiliation and membership of an institution, whether that's a faith group or a trade union or a neighborhood group or some kind of charity, or even if it's a sports club or something, being a member of something, being part of something, and not being an individual, I think is really good for your soul, and
Mm.
provides you with relationships and connections which help support you through the challenges that you will face in life, but also help equip you with the tools to be a good citizen, and as all of us do that, help equip our society with the right characteristics to help us live together, and and support each other well. So I think these institutions that people are moving away from are kind of crucibles of democracy when they work really well. And they are teaching people how to live with people who are different, how to speak in public, how to vote to decide things, how to become leaders. All of these things we can learn in the context of institutions. They provide kind of safe spaces where that happens. And I worry that when we move away from them and we don't join new institutions, we are missing out on the training and the development and the nurturing that we need.
There's been so much work in that field. Robert D. Putnam, the Harvard-based political scientist, and he
Yeah.
obviously argues that same point, that social capital has been declining so much since the 1950s.
I think there's something about the these spaces being places where to some extent you can't control who else is part of the group, but you have
Mm.
some kind of um, sense of duty or faithfulness towards them, and that creates tension and challenges. But as we learn to like respond to those tensions and navigate those challenges, I think that helps us become better people, because it widens our understanding of life and of the world. It makes us more empathetic, and I think it means that we're less likely to be self-interested or to move towards extremes. So at when I go to a church on Sunday, um I'm sharing that space with and have relationships with people from of all different ages and backgrounds who necessarily will be different to me and think differently from me about all sorts of things. And if I'm going to stay in relationship with them, and if my life in church is going to be a pleasant and fulfilling one, I need to, on some level, learn to empathize with those people, to care about them, to get
Mm.
to know them, to listen to some of their stories, if it's going to work. Now, I could just be really frustrated by the fact that all these people are really different from me, and I could leave and maybe try and hang out with only the people that are very similar to me. But I think I'd be really missing out on some of the richness of life by doing that.
Mm. It will be of no surprise to the listeners by this point of our conversation that you were featured in the Power List of Britain's 100 most influential Black people. I wanted to ask you what your thoughts and reflections on the recent events in the US were, and the response, obviously, that has gone around the world.
I've been, in some ways, pleasantly surprised by the big increase in awareness and solidarity that's been shown primarily, that's been shown by white people and by organizations that haven't previously been speaking about racial justice. And I make that point advisedly because obviously racism is something that is a daily reality for Black people around the world. So this isn't new. But the huge amount of support and solidarity and the gestures that we're seeing, that's been pleasantly surprising. I've been taken aback by how much it's connected with people, and I think maybe COVID-19 has something to do with that. The fact that a lot of people have been in lockdown, and um, basically there's been less stuff going on and fewer excuses to look away. I'm hoping that three things happen though, because I think this is an interesting moment, but I think it's crucial that we use the moment in the best possible way. So I really hope that every organization or institution seizes this opportunity and kind of uses it as a catalyst to have uncomfortable conversations and to do some deep listening to Black people that are part of their community, and to make practical changes to what they do. And so I mean,
Mm.
their policies, their leadership, their recruitment, how they spend their money, practical, tangible changes to what they are doing in response to this moment. I think my second hope is that because of this moment, people maybe stop thinking about racism just in terms of individual deliberate actions of violence or hostility against specific people, which I think is often how we're taught to think about racism. To be racist is to be that individual who does that specific
Yeah.
bad thing to that person. Um, and for all of us to start thinking about racism and racial justice in a broader way. So to think about like the wider ways in which the choices that we all make and how we use our resources and our money lead to different and often unfair consequences for people. Um, Even if the individual actions might be well-meaning, right? I think
Mm.
if we can think about racism in those terms, in the kind of structural and institutional way, rather than just obsessing about what individual people believe or specific extreme actions of hostility, that will also be helpful, because I think most people, um, thankfully in this country, I think most people understand the importance of not being individually hostile to people and discriminatory. But I think we are naive because we don't think about the wider structural ways in which we contribute towards racist outcomes. And then I think the
Mm.
third hope that I have is that Black people and our allies find ways to move beyond the kind of expression of our righteous anger and the pain that we've been feeling, and can move towards effective building of political power and campaigns for specific tangible solutions in specific places. And I just hope that those of us who are part of this campaign and who are supporting it, like, can also find as much energy and effectiveness in calling for specific changes and develop our our political power behind that.
I wanted to ask you, Tom, that I think that sort of second group that you talked about there, the people who, aren't individually hostile and try,
Mm,
um, you know, not to be racist, but that might fall into those structural traps.
yeah,
I notice, I think, that some people don't talk about race because they're worried about identifying it as a marker of difference.
yeah.
And how would you advise people like that, particularly white people, to basically not to brush it under the carpet and mean that the result of by not wanting to cause offense is that those issues don't get talked about?
Yeah, I think people have maybe been taught to be colorblind or encouraged to think that not mentioning race or not talking about race is the right thing to do, and anytime you go near the subject, there's a risk that you'll say something wrong or do something wrong or be labeled racist. I think people should spend time reflecting on and thinking deeply about how. So I think I'm speaking about white people actually. White people should spend time reflecting and thinking deeply about their whiteness and how being white may have given them certain advantages. Essentially, that's about like how being white in lots of ways in this society gives you an advantage, and how being black puts you at a disadvantage. I think it's fine to talk with black people about race, but I just hope that people do it with some sensitivity. And
Mm.
so, what I mean by that is by being genuine about your desire to listen to people's stories and hear their experiences, and not kind of second guess or immediately challenge
Mm.
or be defensive about it. Just be open to hearing what people have to say, even if it is quite difficult or quite painful to hear. It's a hard conversation because um, the reality is that like racism exists to promote and put white people at an advantage, basically. And I think that is something that needs to be accepted. And once people accept that, then you can get to work thinking about, okay, well, how do we reverse that trend, or how do we um, what could be our counterbalance to that culture?
Mm. Thank you for that. The Guardian, unsurprisingly, tipped you as a future Prime Minister. If you were in number 10, what would you be looking to address? And maybe part of that, given your experience at the moment, is what is your vision for a better future for communities across the UK?
Mm, that's a good question. Oh, if I was in number 10, what would I do? That's a great question. Too many things. I think. All right. So I suppose my vision for communities would be individual people who've got a sense of their own power and who see themselves as leaders who can make change happen, combined with strong local civil society organisations who are in relationship with each other, and then that has to be supported by accountable and accessible government that doesn't treat individuals or communities with a kind of parent teenager sort of relationship, but actually respects them and values them as equally responsible for the health of our society and our democracy. Yeah, if I were in number 10 tomorrow, I would be committing £1.4 billion to the social care system in order to fund the real living wage for all care workers. I would be prioritizing and increasing um, support and funding and resources for mental health, which is something which I think has also historically been neglected. Um, but also, despite the positive changes and increases in conversations that people are having about mental health and the reduction in stigma, which is really good, I still think that needs to be backed up by actual additional resources. And I'd probably be advocating more um, devolution to local authorities or elected mayors or combined authorities, whatever setup you have, to give um, places an even stronger sense of their own power and the ability and freedom and money to make decisions locally, which then makes local democracy function a lot better.
Such fantastic ideas that you've shared with me today. Just before you go, I would love to ask you, as I ask all my guests, if this idea of wide mindedness resonates with you, and if so, how?
Yes, wide mindedness does resonate with me. because I believe really strongly that we need to be proactive in listening to other people's stories and sharing our own stories with others in order to be good citizens. I believe that our organizations need to be wide minded in terms of how they pursue their purpose. So rather than just inheriting what we've already done in the past, they should be active in listening to their members and the wider community and listening to other communities to help them shape what they do. And I suppose I think that our decision makers and government should be wide minded in thinking beyond kind of Westminster and Whitehall and encouraging communities to provide the solutions to the problems that they face. So yes, wide-mindedness definitely resonates with me.
Tom Chigbo, thank you so much for joining me today. I've literally loved every minute of our conversation and it's been a real honour. Thank you so much.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Widemindedness with Victoria Ball. Help others learn about it by rating, reviewing and subscribing. For more great wide-minded content, follow @Widemindedness Victoria Ball on Instagram, @Widemindedness on Twitter, and sign up to the monthly newsletter at victoria-ball.com.